nearing the end of chapter 8. We are not going to get through the entirety of chapter 8, as we will look at in a little bit. This is a bit of an interesting passage, but to kind of understand where we are, let's review a little bit last week of what we just saw, because we saw a very interesting account and a very powerful example of the deity of Christ. The power that he has not only over the physical but also over the spiritual. As we saw him healing the possessed man, not just one demon, but there were several demons that possessed this man, and this man was indeed healed. Now, it was a very peculiar case because it was very different from the pattern that we've seen Jesus have within his ministry. Up to this point in our study, Jesus has been extremely popular. He has had crowds following him from place to place. Every city that he would enter, there would be a crowd waiting for him. But as Jesus and his disciples entered into this new region, they got there by boat, because the previous passage talked about how Jesus calmed the waves and that miracle that took place. But this region was not one that was primarily occupied by Jewish people. It was primarily occupied by Gentiles. So this was a little bit of a change of scenery, and maybe even a little bit of a refreshing scene for Jesus, that he wasn't thronged by people as soon as he stepped on the land, but rather there was only one man that came to greet him. The only one that came to greet him was this man who was possessed by these demons. Without getting into too much detail and re-preaching the same sermon that we looked at last week, we saw kind of this back and forth between Jesus and the demons. And throughout this dialogue, we saw Jesus' power on display. And it was a power that was on display that was showing particularly, and one of the reasons it was recorded for us, is that his power was greater than the modern day superstition. And it was just merely superstition, because throughout this event, this back and forth between the demons and Jesus, the demons were trying to gain power over Jesus in different ways and through the superstition of the day. But we see that ultimately that power was of no avail. There was no power that they could have over Jesus. Jesus had complete control, complete power, even over what many people considered to be the superstition of the day. These demons ended up being cast out of the man, entered into a herd of swine, and as these pigs were possessed, they ran down over a cliff and ended up drowning in a sea. Now, after this took place, the man who was possessed returned to being sane, and he was sitting at the feet of Jesus learning when those who were tending the pigs had gone and gotten all the townspeople. All the townspeople came to see what everything was about, and instead of being happy or even being curious about what had happened and what Jesus had done for this man whom they had been fearful of and had tried to bound and shackle several times, and now seeing him in his right mind, instead of being happy or cheerful, they were afraid. And they were so afraid that they demanded that Jesus leave. So Jesus left as soon as he pretty much got to this new city. But the man who was possessed by the demons wanted to follow after Jesus. He wanted to go with them and his disciples. But Jesus told him a greater work that he had for him. The greater work that he was to be a witness and testimony in the town that was so fearful of Jesus that they basically kicked him out, and to be a witness and testimony for what Jesus had done to those people there. This leads us to where we are this week. They re-entered their boat. They did not have another storm this time. It was smooth sailing, getting back to where they previously were. And they returned to the city that they were in before. This is where we are picking up, and it's an interesting passage, as I mentioned in the beginning, because this passage covers an event inside of an event. Have you ever set out to do something, but along the way, something else popped up and turned you away from your original purpose? That happens to me all the time, where I set out to do something, and then something else comes up, and it completely diverts from what the original thing was, and I focus on that. I think a lot of that may particularly be due in part to having a toddler who will insert himself at every possible moment that he can, which is 99% of the time joyous. 1% maybe not so much, but either way, it's fun. But we probably all have moments like it. And that's kind of what's happening here, where Jesus is setting out on a certain purpose, but something takes place along the way that is worthy enough to be recorded for us in Scripture, not just here in the account of Luke, but in some of the other Gospels as well. So this was a significant event that took place within an event. So this morning, instead of trying to cover both events together and having a long sermon that would inevitably go way over, we are going to break it into the two separate parts, and they may end up being a little bit shorter, or they may be close to the same amount. We'll see as we get through it. I was thinking this one may be shorter than as I prepared it, end up being the same length. So we'll see what happens as we go through this. But we'll be looking at verses 40 through 48 specifically. The whole passage goes to the end of the chapter in verse 56. But we'll be looking just at verses 40 through 48. Or 43 through 48 rather. 40 through 43 has a little bit of context. So we'll be looking this morning at 5 lessons from a desperate woman. 5 lessons from a desperate woman. So before we get into verse 43, let's just read verses 40 through 42 to kind of set the stage of where Jesus is coming from. So beginning in verse 40 of Luke chapter 8, follow along as I read aloud. And it came to pass that when Jesus was returned, the people gladly received him, for they were all waiting for him. And behold, there came a man named Jairus, and he was a ruler of the synagogue, and he fell down at Jesus' feet and besought him that he would come into his house. For he had one only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she lay dying. But as he went, the people thronged him. So we're seeing in this passage that Jesus returns, the disciples return, and there is a large crowd waiting. And there's this man Jairus, who was the ruler of the synagogue. And if you remember, Jesus' ministry typically was to go and teach in many of the synagogues. So Jairus would have been familiar with Jesus, and Jesus with Jairus. And Jairus comes and implores Jesus to come with him because his only daughter, his 12-year-old daughter, is sick to the point of death. So Jesus agrees, and they are attempting to make their way to Jairus' house. But as they are attempting to make their way to Jairus' house, we see the crowds are so great that they are thronged against Jesus. They are pressing against Jesus. One way that I've seen people kind of interpret this is that it was to the point where they could barely make it through. They were trying to push people away, almost choking out Jesus and his disciples trying to make their way to Jesus' house. So that kind of sets the picture of the fanfare that was taking place over what Jesus had done in the scene that we're about to see. All of these people pressing up against Jesus, pressing up against the disciples to where it's difficult for them to even move, let alone move without touching him. But this is where we see the desperate woman in our first lesson. The first lesson that we can learn is you can turn to Jesus for help. You can turn to Jesus for help. Let's look at verses 43 and 44. It says, and a woman having an issue of blood 12 years, which had spent all her living upon physicians, neither could be healed of any, came behind him and touched the border of the hem of his garment. And immediately her issue of blood stanched or ceased. We are introduced to the desperate woman and her predicament, what made her so incredibly desperate. This woman who was in the crowd had a disease or some issue. And it was an issue to where she would have a continuous or constant flow of blood. This is more than likely an issue with the natural process that a woman's body goes through monthly. But instead of it being for a period within a month, this was a constant, and it was a constant for 12 years. Now at first, this may not seem like a terribly big deal, as it actually was in the passage. I mean, it would have been very inconvenient, and it would have been very uncomfortable. But there is a cultural perspective here that we have to recognize to really understand the true nature of the issue that is taking place here. In the Jewish religion, the Jewish culture, anything having to do with blood or bleeding made somebody unclean. And if anyone dealt with blood or dealt with bleeding, they would have to go through a cleansing process, a particular cleansing process. This was the case with every scenario that involved blood. There was a cleansing process that needed to take place. Until you went through that cleansing process, you would be considered unclean. And until you were clean, you were essentially rejected and shunned from everything. So if you were considered unclean, so this woman was considered unclean continuously for 12 years, this means that she was shunned and rejected for this case. And it's also important for us to mention, this will tie in a little bit later, that normally and typically, someone unclean was not made clean by touching someone who was indeed clean. But rather, a clean person would be made unclean by the unclean person touching them. So again, there was a process for cleansing, but it wasn't that a particular person within the synagogue or the temple, or a person who was good, can go and touch this unclean person and say, okay, I'm transferring my cleanness to you, so now we're both clean. That's not how it worked. But rather, if that unclean person, if this woman had touched anyone, that would make them unclean. So now we're hopefully really gaining the picture of what's taking place here. More than likely, this woman was alone. Everyone had abandoned her, even her own family, because of the fact that her disease made her consistently and continually unclean, to where that even if she wanted to go through this cleansing process, because it was a continuous issue within her body, as soon as she would have been cleansed, it would have happened again and she would have been unclean. She would have never been ceasing to do this cleansing ritual. So normal people, her friends, her family, all would have stayed away because they did not want to be made unclean. And the reality of her even being in the crowd and being recognized within this crowd would have been an incredible risk for her to take. So this lady was in a very difficult situation. Not only was she isolated and unclean and uncomfortable for 12 years, but in that span of time, it also mentions that she has used all of her resources to try to find a doctor who could heal her of this disease, but it was to no avail. So she is also poor. She has no more resources. She has exhausted every possible thing that she could have done, every resource she could have used, every option she had to try to be healed of this, and none of it worked. So get the picture. This woman had nothing left. She was alone. She was sick. She was poor. She was broken. She was desperate. There seemed to be no hope for this woman, except there was one. There was one whom she had heard, one whom she may have even seen. And she recognized that this one could heal her, could restore her. And that one was Jesus. But another issue pops up. How would she ever get to him? Not only how would she get to him, but how would she ever get his attention to heal her? What if he refused to heal her because she was unclean? But she was desperate. There were no other options. So she took the risk. She waded through the crowds. She got to the point where she could see Jesus. She could almost get to him. And she reaches out and touches the hem of his garment. Before we get into what happens, the lesson here is very clear. Just as this woman needed to turn for Jesus in her time of need, so too must we turn to Jesus when we are. Whatever our need may be, no matter what situation we may find ourselves in, no matter what others may think. When we have a need, it is not that we should turn to Jesus when there's absolutely zero hope, and that isn't time when we can turn to Jesus. But rather, turn to Jesus immediately. It's not a matter of should, it's a matter of must. Our needs must be met by Jesus. He's the only one that can truly meet our needs. And we all have them. We can all probably think in our lives today of something that we feel that is a need. It may be a spiritual need, it may be a physical need, it may be an emotional need, it may be a need in relation to someone else. We all have needs. It's very clear to see that we're all a needy people, including myself. But we serve a God who delights in meeting needs, who can meet needs. So we must turn to him when we have a need. This leads us to our second lesson, and that's that Jesus has the power to meet needs. Jesus has the power to meet needs. Verse 45, and Jesus said, "Who touched me?" When all denied, Peter and they that were with him said, "Master, the multitude thronged thee and pressed thee, and sayest thou, Who touched me?" Jesus said, "Somebody had touched me, for I perceive that virtue is gone out of me." Now, let's pair that with the end of verse 44. Because Jesus is now recognizing that virtue or power has left him. And why has virtue or power left him? Well, because this woman touched the hem of his garment, and the issue of the blood stopped. This is the miracle. A miracle that maybe even the woman herself did not expect. Because as the woman reached out and touched the hem of Jesus' garment, she was healed immediately. It wasn't that she touched the hem of his garment and a few weeks later the blood started to slow down, and a few more weeks later it ceased, but immediately. As she touched Jesus' garment, she was healed. Now she would still be considered unclean, which actually provides for us another aspect of Jesus' power other than his ability to heal physical needs. Because we mentioned how, since this woman was unclean, that her touching others would make them unclean. Jesus was not an ordinary man. So yes, another ordinary man would be considered unclean. But Jesus is the Son of God. His power was greater than her uncleanness. Because it wasn't that she touched Jesus and all of a sudden he was unclean. But rather she touched Jesus and her uncleanness was immediately gone and she was made pure and made whole. This shows that Jesus has the power over the spiritual as well as the physical, something that we are continuously seeing highlighted for us throughout the book of Luke. That Jesus meets physical needs, but he also meets spiritual needs. This is a very important point for us to remember. Because this reminds us that no matter what our needs may be, whether they're physical or whether they're spiritual, Jesus has the power to heal. He healed this woman who for 12 years no doctor could get anything to work, in the immediate or in the long term. But he didn't summon this power. This power wasn't that Jesus had to go and do some ritual to accomplish, but rather this power was just an overflowing of his deity. He is so powerful that just the touching of his garment healed this woman. If Jesus has this power, then why do we ever doubt that he would have the power to meet our needs? Why are we so hesitant to turn to him? Many times it's because we view our needs and our issues in the perspective of human wisdom, in the perspective of human power. We think that humanly this can't be done. But we're not appealing to a human, we're appealing to God. Because we are appealing to God, we are appealing to the one who is all-powerful, then it's not viewed in the light of man's strength, it's viewed in the light of God's strength. And that is, Jesus knows our situation. We looked at this in verses 45 through 46. We already read it, so we're not going to read it again. But upon touching his garment and being healed, Jesus stops and says to his disciples, "Who touched me?" Paraphrasing here. Who touched me? All the people around? Not me. I didn't touch you. I didn't touch you. Then we see Peter speaking up. Eventually see this become more and more deep. Peter speaking up. And what he says actually makes a lot of sense. But yet he misses the point. Which again is something consistent with Peter. We'll see that part. But he almost sarcastically or mockingly says, "What do you mean, who touched you? We're surrounded by people." Maybe a better question would be, who didn't touch you? Again, they were pressed by people, which one makes it kind of humorous that anyone denied touching. But also the fact that that's a very specific question to ask. But Jesus says, "Someone touched me and I felt the power leave my body." Jesus knew he healed someone. It wasn't done by accident. He knew it happened. And in all reality, he already knew who was healed. But he was questioning to make a point. And he was questioning to teach a lesson to those around him. And a lesson for us as well, as we observe today. Jesus had full knowledge of the situation. And he knew that this was going to happen even before he arrived. But it's at this point that the woman replied. We haven't read this verse yet, so we'll read verse 47. This reply is very interesting. It says, "When the woman saw that she was not hid, she came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared to him before all the people for what cause she had touched him, and how she was healed immediately." The woman knows the Jesus. She couldn't hide the multitudes of people anymore. So she comes forward. She's trembling. She's fearful. And again, think of this fear. She was unclean. Was she about to be called out from all these people touching Jesus who was unclean? What is Jesus going to say to her? What is going to happen? Yet she still confesses that she was the one who touched him. And that upon touching him, she was immediately healed. And it was at this point that I can imagine the crowd almost gasping. She was unclean. She touched Jesus. Is Jesus unclean? What happened? But the emphasis of this point isn't the crowd gasping. The emphasis of this point is that Jesus knew everything. Jesus knew the woman was there. Jesus knew she had a need. He knew that she was going to touch him. He knew the power left him and healed her. And he knew that this was going to be an opportunity for this woman to also be an incredibly strong testimony. This is a great reminder for us that nothing catches Jesus by surprise. There isn't a situation where Jesus is shocked. There's no point in which he's up in heaven and says, "Oh, I didn't see that coming." There's no plan B. He knows everything. He knows everything that does happen. And the part that is really hard for us to fathom is not only does he know everything that does happen, he knows everything that possibly could happen. All these variants of decisions, he knows every possibility. If this is the case, if we believe this, why do we think that at times Jesus doesn't know what we're going through? Why do we doubt that Jesus cares? There are many times where we think that he's turned a blind eye to our plan. But what would ever cause us to think that? We can take great comfort in the fact that Jesus knows our lives better than we know our own lives. He not only knows what we're going to do, but he knows on the other side of everything that we're going through. So we must trust Jesus during both times of ease and times of difficulty, because he's the one who has the power and knows our situation and knows our need. This leads us to our fourth and final lesson this morning. Your faith enables action. Your faith enables action. Verse 48. And he said to her, Daughter, be of good comfort. Thy faith has made thee whole. Go. Jesus says to the woman to be of good cheer, be of good comfort. Because of your faith, you have been healed. You have been made whole. Because this woman not only had faith that Jesus could heal her just by the touching of his garment, but also she had faith to step out and confess that she was the one who touched Jesus, even though there could have been shock waves from this action. But in both of these cases, the point is valid, that faith enables action. Her faith is what enabled her action, inevitably what caused her infirmity to be healed at the touch of Jesus. Because remember, there were plenty of people touching Jesus. They had problems. Some of them may have been sick. Why weren't they healed? Why didn't their problems heal? Why did hers? Well, it was because of her faith. She believed that Jesus could do it, and took action, and that action paid off because she was fully healed immediately at merely touching his clothes. And the application here is to a purpose. First, our faith should drive our action. Just as the woman stepped out in faith because she believed that Jesus could heal her, so we need to step out in faith that Jesus will meet our needs. The second part of the application is that the woman was healed because of her faith. Her faith enabled the action on the part of Jesus. Jesus wants us to depend on him. And he is willing to meet our needs if we depend on him. So our faith needs to not only drive our action, but our faith leads to action on the part of Jesus. As we conclude this morning, we've looked at the account of a desperate woman. She was sick. She needed to be healed. She had exhausted all of her options. And when all these options had failed, she turned to the one who could actually help her. That one who was Jesus. So we must ask ourselves these questions. First, do I turn to Jesus when I need help? There are so many places we can turn. But in all reality, we must turn to Jesus. And the wonderful part is, we don't need to turn to Jesus when all other options have failed. We can turn to Jesus at any time for any purpose. There's no too early to turn to Jesus, and there is no too late to turn to Jesus. We can turn to him for our help and to meet our needs when we have needs. Secondly, do you believe that Jesus has the power to meet your needs? Oftentimes we look at our problems and our needs from far too much of that earthly human perspective. We need to switch our thinking and see problems and needs from Jesus' power and from his perspective. And we see Jesus for who he truly is, that our confidence in his power will only increase. Third, do you believe that Jesus knows your situation? It is tempting to think that Jesus doesn't know because we don't see him work in a way that we think he should. But Jesus knows. He knows better than we. And we must trust that because of his knowledge and because of his perfection as God, that we may think, that even though we may think Jesus ought to do something, and what he does do may not be what we think should happen, we can have faith and trust that Jesus knows what needs to happen and will accomplish what needs to happen. So even though there may be times where we think to ourselves, why aren't you doing anything? Or we may think to ourselves, well, why did you do that? That needs to turn to, okay, God, what are you doing? Because I know what you're doing. Help me to see how what you're doing is. Fourth and finally, does your faith enable action? Is your faith strong enough to cause you to act? Are you willing to step out in faith because you trust Jesus? In many cases, Jesus will only work if we show that level of faith, because he wants us to turn to him. So do not hesitate to show your faith in your action and see how Jesus works on your behalf. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for this account recorded for us in Luke. We are thankful for the faith of this woman. We are thankful for the courage of this woman. We're thankful for the many needs that you have met in our own lives, the power that you have shown, the knowledge that you have. Lord, I pray that you would help us to be reliant on you. Lord, help us to turn from our own knowledge, from our own wisdom, from our own power, and turn to you for your knowledge and wisdom. Trust that as you meet our needs, that the way you meet them is the way you know is best. Praise things in Jesus' name. Number 418 as we